The guest list that changed everything. The night sky above Delhi was alive with excitement. Lights covered the streets like rivers of gold, and the air buzzed with whispers of one of the most important events of the year. Leaders, entrepreneurs, celebrities, and diplomats were gathering for a grand ceremony, hosted in honor of a new technological initiative. The Prime Minister himself was expected to give a speech that would be remembered for decades. The guest list was a tightly guarded secret, and only the most influential names had been invited. But there was one name that everyone expected to see, one name that had become a symbol of India's rising global power, Sundar Pichai. But his name wasn't on the list. The moment the news leaked, the shock spread like wildfire. How could it be? The CEO of one of the world's biggest companies, a man born and raised in India, someone who had inspired millions, was missing from the guest list. Journalists began whispering in corners. Social media exploded with speculation. Some said it was an oversight. Others claimed it was intentional. Memes spread, theories multiplied, and the air grew heavy with curiosity and tension. While the world debated, Sundar sat quietly in his office thousands of miles away. His team had informed him gently, worried about his reaction. He had simply nodded, thanked them, and gone back to reading a report. He didn't speak much about it, but deep inside something shifted. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He knew the world worked in strange ways, but a part of him wondered if this was a moment that would define him in unexpected ways. As the event drew closer, the pressure on the organizers increased. Journalists kept asking if Sundar would make a surprise appearance. Political aides dodged the questions. Meanwhile, Sundar received a quiet invitation. Not to the main stage, not to the dinner, but to an informal roundtable discussion happening on the sidelines the day before the main event. It was not a glamorous space. No cameras, no flashing lights. Just a few policymakers and young entrepreneurs discussing technology's role in rural development. Most people in his position would have declined politely, but Sundar said yes. On the morning of the discussion, the sky over Delhi was covered in a light mist. Cars moved slowly through the crowded streets. Sundar arrived without an entourage, wearing a simple outfit that made him blend in easily. There was no red carpet, no photographers waiting for him. He walked through the hallway quietly, as if he were just another delegate. Some people noticed him and were stunned. They whispered to each other, wondering why a man of his stature was here in such an ordinary setting. Inside the room, a group of young innovators sat nervously around a circular table. They were rural engineers, social workers, and small business founders from different parts of the country. Most had never been in the same room as a global tech leader before. When Sundar entered, they froze. They expected speeches, perhaps a short greeting, and then for him to leave. But instead he sat down among them, smiled, and said softly, "Tell me your stories." What followed was something no one expected. For hours Sundar listened. He didn't dominate the conversation. He didn't try to impress anyone with his title. He asked thoughtful questions, encouraged the shy ones to speak, and gave small but powerful pieces of advice that came from his own journey. He talked about growing up in Chennai, about using a rotary phone for the first time, about standing in long queues to use technology others took for granted. He spoke with warmth, humility, and patience. At one point, a young woman from a small village in Bihar broke down while explaining how her startup was struggling to bring internet access to rural schools. The government paperwork was endless. The funding was drying up, and no one believed in her vision. Sundar leaned forward, looked her in the eyes, and told her about a moment in his life when everyone around him doubted his decisions. He spoke about resilience, not as a motivational slogan, but as something raw and real. Her tears turned into quiet determination. Others in the room felt their own burdens lighten. As the discussion ended, Sundar did something unexpected. He asked each participant to share one concrete idea they believed could change lives if given the right support. He promised to follow up personally through his team, not with press releases or publicity, but through real action. Everyone in that room left with a strange sense of hope, like they had witnessed something bigger than themselves. No cameras had captured it. No headlines were written that day, but seeds had been planted. Later that evening, as the main event's rehearsal was happening across the city, a junior aide in the Prime Minister's office noticed Sundar's name trending again, not because he had been excluded, but because whispers of what he had done in that small round table were beginning to spread. Attendees had shared their experiences on social media, describing how the world's most influential CEO had spent hours listening to unknown innovators. Hashtags began to form. The narrative was shifting. But while the outside world started to take notice, Sundar himself returned to his hotel room quietly. He didn't post anything. He didn't call any journalist. He simply opened his notebook and began writing down ideas he had heard that day. As he wrote, a thought crossed his mind. Sometimes the biggest spotlight finds you when you stop chasing it. And just as he closed the notebook, his phone buzzed. It was a message from someone unexpected, someone whose words would change everything. The message that shook the silence. The message came late at night, just as the city outside Sundar's hotel window fell into a rare moment of quiet. Traffic sounds faded, and the streets that were filled with chatter only hours ago now rested under a soft orange glow from distant streetlights. Sundar sat at the small wooden desk in his room, surrounded by papers filled with notes and ideas from the round table. His mind was calm, focused, until the familiar vibration of his phone broke the stillness. The screen lit up with a name he had not expected to see. An old classmate from his engineering college, Arjun Mehta. They had not spoken in over 15 years. Arjun's message was short, but it carried weight. I need to talk to you. It's about tomorrow. You won't believe what's happening behind the scenes. Sundar leaned back in his chair. The words were strange, urgent, and unsettling. He stared at the message for a few seconds before replying with a simple, I'm listening. Within minutes, his phone rang. Arjun's voice was low and tense, almost as if he were speaking from a hidden place. He told Sundar that the guest list controversy was not an accident. It had been the result of internal political disagreements between powerful groups who wanted to control the event's narrative. Some wanted Sundar on stage. Others thought his presence might overshadow key political figures. So to avoid any unexpected headlines, they quietly kept his name off the official list. They thought you'd be too busy to come anyway, Arjun said bitterly. They didn't expect you to show up at that small discussion. Now your presence is making more noise than their carefully planned event. Sundar listened without interrupting. His face showed no anger, but his heart tightened. He had never been a man driven by ego, but hearing how deliberate the decision had been left a silent ache. It wasn't about the stage or the cameras. It was about something deeper, about how easily humility could be misread as insignificance. Arjun continued, explaining that some within the organizing committee were now debating whether to extend a last-minute official invitation to him for the main event. But others were resisting fiercely, afraid that his calm presence might become the center of attention. They're arguing right now, Arjun whispered. Tomorrow morning everything could change. After the call ended, Sundar remained by the window looking out at the dim city skyline. Memories surfaced of his early days in Chennai, of waiting for hours to use a shared telephone, of sitting on the floor of a classroom with broken fans, of teachers who believed in him when no one else did. None of that had prepared him for boardrooms filled with quiet power plays and political strategies. Yet somehow he had learned to navigate those spaces without losing his gentleness. He knew that the coming day would test that balance more than ever. Early the next morning, a gentle knock echoed through his hotel room. His assistant entered with a sealed envelope marked urgent. Inside was an official letter from the event committee. It was carefully worded, polite, but distant. They were inviting him to attend the ceremony, but only as a special observer, not as a speaker or guest of honor. They suggested that he take a reserved seat in the second row, visible but not central. The letter ended with a line that felt almost like a warning. Your attendance will be greatly appreciated, but we request no public statements during the proceedings. He read it twice, then placed it on the table. For a moment he felt the weight of expectation pressing against him. His team suggested that declining the invitation would make a strong statement. Others thought accepting it would show grace. Sundar said nothing. He took a slow breath and asked everyone to leave the room so he could think alone. When the door closed, the silence returned, heavy and deep. His mind wandered back to the young woman from Bihar, the one whose voice trembled when she spoke of her dream. He remembered the quiet hope in the eyes of the innovators who had sat with him the day before. He realized that his decision was not about prestige or politics. It was about what kind of example he wanted to set. If he let pride guide him, he would become exactly what some people expected, a distant figure who cared only about appearances. But if he showed up with quiet strength, he could shift something deeper in the way people saw power. He decided he would go, not because they asked him, but because sometimes showing up is more powerful than being invited. As the sun began to rise, the streets outside filled with convoys and flashing lights. Security officers took their positions. Journalists adjusted their cameras, waiting for cars to arrive. The air was thick with ceremony and control. Sundar stepped out of his room, dressed in his usual simple style. No bodyguards surrounded him, no photographers followed him. He walked through the lobby with a calmness that made people turn their heads. When he reached the venue, his car was stopped at the first security gate. The guards looked at their list, hesitated, and then waved him through after checking his letter. He could see the large stage in the distance, decorated with banners and flowers and rows of chairs arranged like a grand theater. But what caught his eye was not the stage. It was a small group of journalists huddled near the side entrance, whispering excitedly. One of them noticed him and pointed. Cameras began to lift. Within seconds, the quiet space turned into a rush of movement. Reporters ran forward, calling his name. "Sir, why weren't you on the guest list? Will you be making a speech today? Do you feel disrespected?" He gave no answers. He simply smiled and walked past them, his silence louder than any statement. The organizers, watching from inside, scrambled to manage the sudden media attention. They had planned the event down to the smallest detail, but they had not planned for this. His presence, calm and unannounced, had become the story before the ceremony even began. Inside the hall, as guests took their seats, some eyes turned to Sundar with warmth, others with curiosity, and a few with discomfort. He sat quietly in his assigned seat in the second row, folding his hands in his lap, observing everything. He didn't look like a man excluded. He looked like a man who understood his place so deeply that no seating arrangement could define it. And then, just as the opening music began and the announcer's voice echoed through the speakers, a man in a dark suit rushed toward the front of the hall. He leaned down to whisper something urgently to one of the organizers, who stiffened immediately. The man's eyes darted toward Sundar. Something had happened. Something that could turn the entire event upside down. The spotlight that moved on its own, the man in the dark suit whispered urgently to the organizer. And though Sundar couldn't hear the words, he noticed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The organizer's confident posture collapsed into visible tension, as if the message carried the weight of a storm. Murmurs spread slowly through the first few rows like ripples moving across still water. The ceremony had not even begun, and already something unexpected was unfolding behind the scenes. Sundar remained still, watching, not reacting. Years of boardroom surprises had taught him that silence often reveals more than questions ever could. A few meters away, hidden behind the stage curtains, two senior officials were locked in a heated argument. Their voices were low but sharp. One insisted that they should invite Sundar to the stage immediately, claiming that his unexpected presence had drawn overwhelming media attention. The other argued fiercely that changing the plan at the last minute would be a mistake, that it would appear as if the committee had been unprepared. Their disagreement wasn't just about a speech. It was about power, control, and the fear of losing the carefully constructed narrative they had built for months. Meanwhile, outside the hall, journalists continued to gather in greater numbers. News of Sundar's arrival spread rapidly across television networks and social media. Live feeds began to circulate with captions like, "The CEO arrives unannounced," and "The guest not on the list becomes the center of attention." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. While official guests walked down red carpets under flashing lights, Sundar had entered quietly through a side gate. And somehow, all cameras had turned toward him. No one planned it. Yet the spotlight had shifted as if drawn by something invisible. Inside the hall, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, smiling with trained precision. The opening music played softly in the background. The program began as planned. Formal welcomes, introductions, and prepared speeches from political leaders. The Prime Minister was expected to arrive later for the keynote. Every movement on stage followed the script. But beneath the surface, the tension grew thicker. The organizers kept glancing toward Sundar's seat, as if expecting him to stand up at any moment, though no such instruction had been given. As the third speaker began talking about India's technological future, the sound system suddenly faltered. The microphone produced a loud crackling noise followed by complete silence. Technicians rushed to fix it, but for several long seconds, the hall was quiet except for the shifting of chairs and the soft whispers of an unsettled crowd. In that moment of pause, Sundar's eyes met those of a young technician kneeling by the stage. The boy looked terrified. Sundar gave him a small, reassuring nod. Something about that quiet exchange calmed the boy, who quickly found the loose connection and restored the sound. The crowd applauded politely, unaware of the invisible thread that had passed between two strangers. Then came the moment that no one had anticipated. As the next speaker approached the podium, she suddenly froze. Her assistant rushed forward and whispered something into her ear. Her face turned pale. She stepped back, shaking her head. The announcer hesitated, unsure of what to do. Someone backstage made a split-second decision, and a voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight change in the program. Please remain seated." People began to murmur again. The media outside started sending rapid updates. Something was happening that wasn't in the schedule. An official hurried toward Sundar's seat and leaned down. His voice was polite but carried a tremor. "Sir, would you be willing to say a few words?" "Just a short address. The scheduled speaker cannot continue. We need someone who can hold the moment." Sundar looked at him quietly. This was exactly the situation the committee had feared. A sudden, unscripted twist that could change the event's direction. He had not prepared a speech. He had not been given a role. And yet every eye in the room slowly turned toward him, as if waiting to see his answer. He rose slowly, not with the swagger of a powerful man, but with the calm presence of someone who understood the weight of silence. The hall grew quiet. The journalists near the entrance began whispering excitedly. Sensing that something significant was about to happen, the organizers exchanged nervous glances. Some relieved, others worried. Sundar walked toward the stage with measured steps, each one echoing faintly across the floor. For the first time, the lights above shifted, casting a soft glow on him. The man who was not supposed to be part of the show was now at the center of it. When he reached the podium, he took a moment before speaking. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the lectern. He looked at the crowd, not as an audience, but as individuals. He saw ministers in crisp suits, young innovators with wide eyes, journalists ready with their pens, and ordinary workers standing at the edges, watching curiously. He began to speak in his calm, steady voice, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. He spoke about journeys, about beginnings, about how some of the most powerful moments in life come not from invitations, but from unexpected turns. He didn't criticize anyone. He didn't draw attention to the guest list. Instead, he told a story about a boy in Chennai who once waited for hours just to make a single phone call, and how that boy learned patience before he learned success. The hall was silent as he spoke, not the forced silence of polite listening, but the deep silence of genuine attention. His words didn't sound rehearsed. They felt lived. He talked about humility as strength, about kindness as leadership, and about how innovation often starts in small rooms, far away from stages like this. As he spoke, some of the organizers who had opposed inviting him felt their resistance slowly dissolve. Others, watching the media reactions in real time, realized that the story of the event had already changed. But just as his speech was reaching its emotional peak, something unexpected happened. A loud alert sound rang through the hall, interrupting his words. People turned toward the back of the room, where security officers were suddenly moving quickly. The announcer's face turned pale. Someone whispered frantically into a headset. Sundar paused mid-sentence, his calm eyes scanning the crowd. The energy in the room shifted from admiration to uncertainty in an instant. Something outside the hall was unfolding. Something that could overshadow everything that had just happened. The silence that followed the alarm. The piercing alert echoed through the hall like a sudden crack in a quiet night. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as if the entire gathering was suspended in an invisible thread of confusion. Then almost instantly, the calm dissolved into movement. Security personnel rushed toward the exits, whispering into their headsets. Guests turned their heads, scanning for answers. The music had stopped. The lights shifted slightly, and the hall that moments ago had been filled with warm attention was now thick with uncertainty. Sundar remained at the podium, steady, watching everything with quiet focus. He had experienced chaos before, but this was different. This was unexpected, and everyone was looking for someone to anchor them. In the far corner near the main entrance, a commotion began. Two security officers gestured toward a group of people outside the glass doors. The guests seated near the front exchanged worried looks. A low wave of murmurs traveled through the rows like a whispering wind. Journalists near the back tried to stretch their cameras high, eager to capture something, anything. The announcer fumbled with his microphone, unsure whether to resume the program or make a statement. Somewhere behind the stage, an official voice shouted instructions, sharp and hurried. And yet amidst the noise and confusion, Sundar's voice broke through, not loud, not commanding, but calm, deliberate, and strangely grounding. "Please stay seated," he said gently, his words carrying through the microphone. "The security team is doing their job. Let us give them space to do it." His tone was not forceful, but it carried an unshakable steadiness that made people pause. Slowly, the restless movement in the hall began to ease. People stopped standing. They turned their attention back to him, as if his composure gave them permission to breathe again. Behind the scenes, the situation became clearer. Outside the building, a small group of protesters had gathered without prior notice. They were not violent, but their sudden arrival had triggered the security protocols. They held banners and chanted slogans about digital privacy and data ethics, targeting not the political leaders but the presence of global technology figures at the event. Sundar's name appeared on some of their placards. They weren't against him personally, but his role as a tech leader had become a symbol in their fight. For the security team, this unexpected gathering was enough to raise the alert. Inside the hall, the tension remained, but the immediate panic began to fade. Sundar stepped away from the podium for a moment and spoke quietly to a nearby official. The official explained the situation. Sundar listened carefully, then nodded slowly. Instead of returning to his seat, he walked toward the side of the stage where a group of young delegates were sitting. Their faces showed a mixture of fear and curiosity. He knelt slightly so he could speak to them at eye level, something few high-profile figures ever did in moments like this. Sometimes, he said softly, when people raise their voices outside, it's not chaos. It's a reminder that we must keep listening, even in uncomfortable moments. His words were not meant for the cameras, but someone near the front recorded the exchange on their phone. Within minutes, that short, quiet moment began spreading online. While the officials inside the hall were trying to contain the situation, the world outside was already watching a different story unfold. A story of calm leadership, of a man choosing empathy over distance. The protesters outside had expected hostility or dismissal. Instead, their presence triggered a display of quiet grace inside. The event organizers, however, were divided. Some felt that suspending the program until the security cleared the protesters was necessary to maintain order. Others believed that continuing the ceremony would show strength. Arguments broke out in the control room. The Prime Minister's arrival was delayed because of the alert, which added to the confusion. Several senior officials were worried that the delay would reflect poorly on their planning. Fingers pointed in quiet blame, and someone even suggested that Sundar's unexpected speech might have disrupted the original timeline. Sundar, unaware of the heated discussions backstage, stood near the edge of the stage, looking at the protesters through the glass doors. They were chanting loudly now, their voices carrying through the hallway. He didn't see enemies. He saw people who believed in something strongly enough to be heard. For a brief moment, a strange memory surfaced. Of his younger days when he had stood in long queues at government offices, waiting for something as simple as a form. He remembered the frustration, the feeling of being invisible in a system too large to hear individual voices. That memory stayed with him like a quiet shadow. Then something unusual happened. One of the security officers approached him and whispered, "Sir, some of the protesters are asking if you would speak to them directly. Not on stage, not for the media, just a few words outside." The suggestion caught the organizers off guard when they heard it. Such a move was not in the plan. It was risky, unpredictable, and completely unscripted. Some officials immediately said no. They feared it would encourage more protests or create an uncontrolled media moment. Others thought it might diffuse the situation in a way no security barrier could. Sundar listened to the officer without rushing to answer. Then slowly he nodded. "I'll speak to them," he said quietly. The organizers tried to stop him, warning about security risks, but he simply replied, "Sometimes the best way to reduce distance is to walk toward it." His decision sent a wave of whispers through the hall. Guests looked at each other, unsure whether to admire his courage or question his judgment. Journalists began to reposition themselves near the doors, sensing that something remarkable was about to happen. With two security officers walking a few steps ahead, Sundar approached the glass doors that separated the hall from the protesters. The chanting softened slightly as people recognized him. Some protesters lowered their banners, unsure of what he would do. The media lights followed him like a slow-moving tide. He stepped outside into the warm afternoon air. The crowd quieted further. For a few seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't stand on a platform. He simply stood among them and began to speak in the same gentle voice he had used inside. He told them that their concerns were valid, that technology's power must always be guided by responsibility, and that their willingness to speak up was a strength, not a threat. He didn't offer empty promises, nor did he defend himself unnecessarily. He listened, responded with honesty and treated them like equals, not outsiders. As he spoke, cameras from multiple angles captured the scene. What had begun as a moment of tension was turning into something unexpected. A powerful image of a leader choosing conversation over confrontation. But just as the crowd began to relax, a commotion started at the far end of the protest line. A few figures wearing masks pushed through the group, carrying something in their hands. Security officers noticed immediately and shouted commands. The calm air shattered again as the masked figures moved closer. Sundar turned his head slightly, sensing the sudden shift. Something was about to happen, something that could change everything. The moment that tested everything. The warm afternoon air shifted sharply as the masked figures pushed through the crowd. It was subtle at first, like the way a breeze changes before a storm. Then the energy in the space cracked open. Protesters stepped back instinctively, creating an uneven circle around the intruders. Their chants faltered into uneasy murmurs. Security officers moved swiftly, forming a thin barrier between the masked figures and Sundar. Their voices rose sharp and coordinated, instructing everyone to stay calm and maintain distance. Cameras zoomed in from every angle. Journalists could sense that something serious was unfolding, though no one knew exactly what these figures carried. Sundar didn't retreat. He stood quietly observing every detail. Years of leading through unpredictable crises had taught him that panic spreads faster than truth, and the way a leader reacts in the first few seconds can shape everything that follows. His security team urged him to step back toward the hall, but he shook his head gently. Retreating in that moment would only increase the crowd's fear. Instead, he took a single step forward, not toward danger but toward understanding. The crowd fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant clicking of cameras and the heavy breathing of people who didn't know what might happen next. One of the masked figures raised his hand slowly. In it, he held a small device wrapped in wires. Security officers immediately drew closer, ready to act. But the figure didn't speak or threaten. He simply stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes darting between Sundar and the officers. The protesters around them looked terrified, unsure whether this was still a protest or something far more dangerous. Sundar noticed the tremor in the man's hands. It wasn't the steady grip of someone planning harm. It was the unsteady grasp of someone carrying too much fear. He raised his hand calmly, signaling the security team to lower their weapons slightly. "Let him speak," Sundar said softly. His voice carried across the tense air like a slow wave. The lead officer hesitated but nodded. Understanding the delicate balance of the moment, Sundar turned his gaze toward the masked man and asked, "What do you want to say?" His tone was not accusatory, not defensive. It was steady, as if he were speaking to an equal in a private conversation, not to a stranger surrounded by flashing lights. The masked man hesitated, then spoke in a shaky but loud voice. "You talk about technology changing lives," he said, "but you don't see what it's doing to us. Our jobs are disappearing. Our children are growing up staring at screens, forgetting who they are. You build systems that control everything, and we have no voice." His words were raw, almost desperate. The protesters listened, some nodding slowly. They had not planned this part. This was not their coordinated message. This was something personal, unfiltered, spilling out like water through a cracked wall. Sundar listened without interrupting. He recognized something in that man's voice, not rebellion, but pain. He stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate. "I see you," he replied gently. "I hear you. I don't have all the answers, but I know this. Real change doesn't happen when we stand on opposite sides. It happens when we find a way to build something together. You're right to question. You're right to speak. Don't think for a moment that your voice doesn't matter." His words didn't sound like a performance. They carried the weight of someone who had spent his life bridging two worlds, one of endless innovation and another of quiet human struggle. The man lowered the device slightly. Security officers remained tense but didn't advance. Sundar kept talking, slowly closing the gap between them. "What you're holding," he said softly, "isn't power. It's fear. And fear can shape the future in two ways. It can break trust or it can build a bridge. You get to choose what happens next." The air around them felt heavy, like the moment just before a decision that would ripple far beyond the people present. Cameras kept rolling, capturing not just an event but a living moment that held more meaning than anyone could fully grasp at that second. Suddenly, a shout came from the far edge of the protest line. Someone yelled something unintelligible, and a bottle flew through the air, shattering against the pavement near the crowd. Panic surged like electricity. Some protesters screamed. Others began to push backward, Security officers moved quickly to form a shield around Sundar. The masked figures, startled, stepped back, raising their hands defensively. The controlled tension of the moment fractured in an instant into chaotic movement. Sundar's team urged him to return to the hall, but his eyes remained fixed on the man in front of him, who now looked as terrified as everyone else. Amid the confusion, Sundar saw something strange. One of the other masked individuals wasn't moving with panic. He was reaching into his jacket, his eyes scanning the crowd with intent. Sundar's instincts sharpened. This wasn't the same kind of fear he had seen earlier. This was something colder, planned. Before he could say anything, two security officers tackled the man to the ground. Shouts erupted as a small black object fell from his hand. Gasps spread through the protesters. The officers secured it quickly, but their faces showed that this was no harmless item. The situation had shifted from emotional protest to real danger. The crowd scattered in waves, journalists shouting into their microphones, protesters tripping over each other to escape. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Sundar stood in the center of it all, still calm, but his heart was beating faster now. He looked around and realized this was no longer just about speeches or guest lists. This was about something much bigger. How moments of vulnerability can be hijacked by those who seek chaos. The masked man he had spoken to earlier stood frozen, staring at the ground, his device hanging loosely in his hand, forgotten. Security officers moved Sundar toward the entrance of the hall, but as they did, one of them whispered urgently into his earpiece. Whatever was said made his expression change immediately. He turned to Sundar with sharp eyes. "Sir, there's been a development inside," he said. "You need to see this." Sundar's steps slowed. Inside, what could possibly have happened now while the world outside was already on fire? He turned back for one last look at the dispersing crowd, at the fragments of an unexpected storm, then followed the officer inside. The corridors felt narrower, the air heavier. As he entered the hall again, the sight before him made him stop in his tracks. The grand stage, which had moments ago been a symbol of control and ceremony, was now occupied by someone unexpected, someone holding the microphone, speaking to the audience with authority. The entire room had turned toward this figure, and in that instant, Sundar realized the story of the day had just taken another turn he hadn't seen coming. The voice that rose above the noise. When Sundar stepped back into the hall, the sound of a single voice filled the space. It was steady, clear, and unfamiliar. The figure standing on the stage was not a politician, not an organizer, and certainly not part of the official program. It was the young woman from Bihar, the same one who had spoken to him at the round table 2 days earlier. She stood at the podium with both hands gripping the edges, her voice trembling slightly at first but gaining strength with every word. The entire hall was silent, not because she had been announced, but because something in her presence demanded attention. She spoke about the forgotten spaces of India, the villages where innovation struggled to survive, where brilliant ideas were trapped behind walls of bureaucracy and silence. She told the story of how she had built a small internet network with limited resources, how she had knocked on doors and faced rejection after rejection, and how she had nearly given up until a conversation at a round table changed something inside her. She didn't mention Sundar by name, but everyone in the room understood who she meant. She spoke not like someone giving a speech, but like someone opening a wound to the world. Sundar watched from the side of the hall, his heart tightening with a quiet, unfamiliar emotion. He had expected chaos when he returned, but instead he found something profoundly different. A voice rising where no one had planned it. The officials on stage shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to stop her or let her continue. Some whispered to each other, worried about the program's timing. Others looked toward Sundar, silently asking for guidance. He gave no commands. He simply stood still, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. As the young woman continued, the crowd leaned in. Journalists who had been distracted by the outside commotion now turned their cameras toward her. Her words cut through the noise of the day with simple honesty. "We don't need promises," she said. "We need people who will listen, not from stages, but from the ground where real lives are lived." The sentence hung in the air like a slow echo. People in the audience who had spent years listening to polished speeches suddenly found themselves moved by the rawness of her truth. Backstage, some officials grew nervous. The Prime Minister's arrival had been delayed again due to the security incident outside, and the carefully planned timeline had fallen apart. They debated whether to interrupt her and resume the formal schedule. But before any decision could be made, something unexpected happened. The audience began to applaud, not politely but with genuine warmth. It started with a few claps, hesitant at first, then grew into a rising wave that filled the hall. The sound was not for a title, not for power, but for truth. The applause reached Sundar where he stood, wrapping around him like an invisible tide. He realized then that she was saying everything that needed to be said, things that he himself had carried inside for years but had never voiced in this way. When she finished speaking, she lowered the microphone and stepped back. For a moment the hall remained silent again, as if everyone was trying to hold on to what they had just felt. Then slowly all eyes turned toward Sundar. He had not planned to speak again. In fact, part of him wanted to leave the moment as it was, untouched, pure. But the weight of 1,000 unspoken expectations filled the space. Someone handed him the microphone and he walked toward the stage quietly. His footsteps echoed softly, steady and unhurried. Standing beside her, he didn't take the center spot. Instead, he positioned himself slightly to the side, acknowledging her presence as equal, not as someone to overshadow. When he began to speak, his voice was low and calm. He didn't give a long speech. Instead, he spoke directly from the heart. He told the audience that leadership is not about who stands at the front, but who listens from within. He spoke about his own journey, how moments of exclusion had often become turning points, how silence sometimes teaches more than applause. Today, he said softly, I was not on the guest list, but I didn't come here to be on it. I came here because listening is more powerful than being announced.